Hello and welcome to another edition of TPA Talks. Joining me this week is Lionel Shriver. Lionel is a writer at Spectator and an author of many books, including We Need to Talk About Kevin. This week we'll be discussing what was happening last week, and that's the US election. Let's explore those issues with Lionel right now. Okay, well, hi Lionel, how are you getting on today?
In my splendid isolation.
I know
I'm doing as well as could be expected.
Well, indeed, I very much know the feeling. So, here we are 9 days after the election, recording on the afternoon of the 12th of November. Obviously, it's not been entirely formalised. The result of the US election, the Electoral College hasn't yet met, so slightly, preemptive to do this, but I mean, at this stage, what do you think are some of the main driving factors which led the US to not re-elect Donald Trump?
Mostly the obvious. He was not widely admired for his handling of the coronavirus, although I think his failing was primarily rhetorical, because public health policy is decided on the state level. And that means that what people were really complaining about is that they didn't have, an orator calling the country to its best self and, we're going to get through this and we need you all to be responsible. And this is a grave crisis for our country. He didn't do that. He played it down. He tried to convince people that it was going to go away. He eventually changed tack and did those nightly briefings, which were an incredible embarrassment, because, he's not very scientifically inclined, which he painfully illustrated, suggesting that one solution might be to inject disinfectant. So, that didn't cover him in glory, though I'm not convinced that on a policy level, he was responsible for many more deaths. And that's, of course, what the Democrats want you to believe. In fact, I think it's rather slanderous to blame Donald Trump for, the 240,000 Americans who have died from this virus. So, but whether or not that was fair, that was obviously a factor. Add to that, I think he lost some of his own supporters in that first debate. He crossed a line, in terms of being unpleasant and belligerent and obstructive. The interruption, he wouldn't argue on the basis of content of policy. He was heavily reliant on ad hominem attack. It was an ugly performance, and I've always found it a little perplexing that, given the nature of the people who support Trump and where they live and how they view culturally, why they are willing to forgive him qualities that would ordinarily put this precise population off. The braggadocio, the immodesty, the impoliteness. These are not generally qualities that people in the breadbasket of the United States admire.
Mm-hmm. And do you think, so because of that, for example, if the first debate, as you alluded to, was very heated, very argumentative, talking over one another, Trump in particular, do you think it would have been the case that if it was a much more sort of, high-minded campaign whereby, for example, the president was talking about, elements of his tax reforms versus, Joe Biden, for example, trumpeting quite a few of the policies which he was implementing when he was part of the previous administration, if it was a slightly sort of high-level, polite process, do you think it might have been a slightly different outcome, or the nature of the two candidates was such that just wasn't really a possibility?
I mean, you can't get away from Trump the person, and he doesn't have the discipline to maintain a persona that is beside himself, or a kind of confection. I mean, that said, I was impressed by the fact that he managed to rein himself in the second debate. And he acted like a politician and almost like a president. So I guess it's in him, but I don't think across the course of the campaign and doing those big rallies, he was inevitably going to revert to type. And the truth is that there is a proportion of his base that likes it, And I'm very anti-Trump, and I have been from the beginning, but I can see the appeal of someone who breaks the rules, who just bull in a china shops through what has been a staid political process. There's certain ways that a politician is meant to behave, and certainly a president is meant to behave. And a lot of his base really enjoyed the fact that he wasn't a traditional president, that he was willing to take rhetorical risks. So, I understand that the little naughty bad part of me understands that.
Right. Okay. And with obviously you're alluding to, his temperament may suggest that for those who are real supporters of him, they shouldn't necessarily warm to that. In terms of what transpired last week, and obviously there were quite interesting changes in some of the demographics and how they were leaning for one candidate over the other. I think, for example, there was an increase in support for Trump amongst most demographic groups, bar, I think,
yes.
White men. In terms of not necessarily the next election or the next few years, but quite long term, is that? Do you sense it's quite a seismic transformation in the way that the US thinks about its leaders, its politics, or is this a bit of a flash in the pan at the moment?
I think it's significant. There's been a prevailing narrative among Democrats in relation to immigration. It's one of the reasons they're so pro-immigration. It's not just ideological; it's also practical. Tony Blair, same thing, right? Let in as many immigrants as possible because they're going to vote for us. And Democrats have been assuming all along that as the country lets more and more immigrants in, and those immigrants have families, that the Democrats are going to get a permanent majority, and the Republicans will be permanently unelectable. And I've not known whether this is true or not, and I have to say that I've dreaded it if it was true, and just on principle and not on a partisan level. It is not healthy for any country to have a one-party state. You don't want one party to permanently control government in the country. And this election suggests that narrative may be completely off base. I think that if we're going to overgeneralize, Hispanics tend to be conservative. And despite the fact that they were told over and over again that Donald Trump is a racist, over a third of Hispanics voted for Trump. And that really means something. And he got 18% of Black men, which is also astonishing. So I don't think the Democrats can take for granted that they necessarily command minority votes. The Democratic Party has transformed enormously, and it's interesting. It's mirrored in the UK with what's happening with the Conservative Party. In the reverse, becoming much more the party of the working class, and the Democrats, by contrast, have become the party of the the liberal elite, educated, white, proudly guilty, very, very well off voters. And that means they're leaving the majority of the country behind. Now, it's not as if it means the Republicans have it in the bag, and I think the Trump era has done the Republican Party a lot of damage, but the Democrats cannot take for granted that in future they're just going to be elected over and over again.
And that's interesting. So obviously that the US is slightly more, I suppose, pushing the vanguard of culture war issues, be it cancel culture on campus, and obviously BLM earlier this year. Do you sense that in light of Joe Biden coming to office next year, although everything is still quite confirmed, do you think that will sort of slightly ease some of these tensions, or quite the reverse, or what would be the temptation for the Democrats to sort of acknowledge that actually demographically we don't have this support, this kind of broad coalition which we kind of assumed was always there, and so because of that we have to think about the culture war issues differently, or do you think it would be broadly unaffected either amongst those who are around the president or in the country as a whole?
Well, it's important to remember that this so-called culture war well predates the Trump era. So Trump's election may have energized so-called cancel culture, but it didn't create it. And in fact, it goes way back, especially on American college campuses. So it's not going away, unfortunately. I would say that the lesson of this election is that however shrill and however much the hard left has managed to dominate most mainstream media, they're still a minority, and an unpopular minority. Let's not forget that Joe Biden was running in the primaries against a huge field of extreme left candidates, and they all lost, including his own vice president. So even the Democrats selected the most centrist candidate among a very crowded field. And furthermore, the other lesson of the election is not so much that Biden won, but that he won by such a narrow margin. I mean, at the beginning of this week, the numbers keep changing because the counting is ongoing. But at the beginning of this week, if three key states had gone slightly differently by a collective margin of 73,000 votes, then Donald Trump would be president next year. That's astonishing. I mean, that is teeny. And even on the popular vote level, 71 to 75 million is not no kind of landslide. It's not this resounding mandate and resounding rejection of the terrible Trump era and we have renounced him for good. No, he came very close to winning. And if just a few things had gone differently, he would be reelected. And that's, of course, in drastic defiance of the opinion polls, which themselves would have acted in a voter suppression direction, because those polls were constantly telling Trump voters they shouldn't even bother to vote because their man was going to lose by a humiliating margin.
That's an interesting point, actually. Obviously, we had not dissimilar situation 4 years ago with the referendum. I think last year was broadly appropriate for what a lot of the work of the pollsters were doing. I wonder, because of that, does that just sort of further encourage a lot of skepticism of a sort of slightly anti-establishment position, which is now seemingly sort of percolating not merely around those who are Trump supporters, but around a lot of the rest of the country? Will they just engender much more skepticism going through the next electoral cycle, do you think?
Well, I mean, I wouldn't be the first person to observe that we are rapidly evolving a situation whereby the left and the right live in different factual universes. And I'm afraid that what's happening with the election result is intensifying that disparity. Trump went to a lot of effort in advance to pave the way for perceiving the election results as fraudulent. And, I mean, that's a giveaway that he expected to lose. So there is a large proportion of the Republican electorate that is going to proceed with a Biden administration believing that his election was illegitimate. And in some ways, the Democrats deserve it because they did the same thing to Trump. They spent a solid 3 years trying to demonstrate that he was elected only with the assistance of a foreign power with whom he actively colluded. And that is an effort to delegitimize the results of the 2016 election. And they went crazy trying to prove that, and they never did. So, turnabout is fair play. This is just the Republicans also trying to delegitimize the results of an election. And, it doesn't do the reputation of the United States any favors in either instance. But we are where we are.
Indeed. And I think, sort of reflecting on stuff which is closer to our hearts at the Taxpayers Alliance, obviously there was much made of the I think the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act a few years back, which was sort of the main tax reforms from the Trump administration. I think they were put into effect almost 3 years ago now. Now I think a lot of the measures are sort of time limited, so within I think 5 to 10 years, a lot of the changes will go back to how they were under the previous administration. Obviously things are still playing out. There's I think Senate races in Georgia at the start of the year, which will sort of determine the final makeup of the federal government. But broadly speaking, Joe Biden has some pretty extreme policies for increases in various taxes on capital and green taxes and so forth. That sounds relatively worrying for U.S. taxpayers, or is it kind of gazing into a crystal ball at the moment in terms of how the government might ultimately be constituted?
Well, if we're going to glass half full about it, Biden's tax policy is not going to be nearly as horrific as his competitors in the primary race. No.
Yeah, fair.
At least it's not Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren. So there's that. However, he's going to raise taxes. I do not believe his promise that he will not raise taxes on anyone who makes less than $400,000. And I've heard such promises from politicians before. What happens is that once they get down to the legislation, they do the sums and they realize, if we only tax the rich, then we're not going to make any money. It's not going to bring in enough. So that threshold sneaks way down because that's the only way you really reap a considerable amount of money out of these kind of freshly punitive tax policies.
Yeah.
So I expect taxes to go up. Obviously, the U.S. is suffering from a lot of the same economic damage of these coronavirus lockdowns as the U.K. is, and they're not over. I don't know whether Biden is stupid enough to try to bring in a national lockdown, but it's not beyond him because the Democrats have positioned themselves as the party of lockdown. They love lockdowns. And, that bodes ill for tax policy because this is just the worst of all possible worlds in terms of taxes. You're busy doling out huge amounts of money in a giant welfare program at the same time that you were decimating your tax base. This does not compute. And
Indeed.
And at some point, you've got to pay the piper. So, Biden has already promised to raise the corporate tax rate, which I think is a mistake. That often fails to bring in any extra money and just drives corporate earnings offshore. And that happens over and over again. So I thought one of the smartest things Trump did was to lower the corporate tax rate, which had been one of the highest in the world. And it was counterproductive. So are very high rates on high net worth individuals. You drive them elsewhere. There's only so much of people's money you can take before they simply won't put up with it. I'm talking to the right person right now, I assume.
Well, indeed, that's the case. I mean, the Internal Revenue Service, which is kind of the US equivalent of HMRC. I mean, they're particularly proactive with seeking out the income and wealth of Americans who deign to live overseas, as I'm sure you may well be familiar with that stuff there. One thing that strikes me, though, I mean, the language, at least in recent months in the US, it isn't so kind of caked around, let's soak the rich. I think whereas in the UK, for example, obviously under the previous leader of the Labour Party over here, I mean, that was very much part of the selling point in terms of this is the rationale for higher taxes because it's the fair policy to go for that. Whereas obviously, as you were kind of alluding to earlier, the perception of the Democratic Party is much more slightly now the party of the rich and Wall Street, whereas Republicans are seemingly more anti-establishment. I wonder whether you sense that slightly, I suppose, politics of envy, that kind of language. Do you think there'll be sort of efficacy in the coming years with potentially a split White House and Congress in terms of how to present these tax policies as, we're not simply raising revenue to, pay down COVID debts, for example, but as a matter of economic justice to effectively sort of go after the rich? Do you think there's some kind of selling point with that, or the American public are kind of, they wouldn't necessarily buy that?
Well, there's a natural tension in the Democratic Party between the redistribution rhetoric amongst the equality-obsessed left wing and the fact that the party gets its money from very wealthy individuals who do not want to have all their money taken away. I mean, there is, as there is over here, a big difference between the rates at which earned income is taxed and capital gains are taxed. And I'd be surprised because of that tension if capital gains taxation goes up that much, because most wealthy people don't live on earned income. They're living on investment income. So, there's actually something very hypocritical about that disparity. I would say on a moral level, if we're going to be that way, it doesn't make any sense for us to be more lenient on investment income, which is passively earned, and yet, if you go out every day and work all day, that gets, we cream that. That doesn't make any sense, and it never has. But I think one of the reasons that it has evolved that way is that, at least in the United States, the U.S. is very dependent on the people who are benefiting from that policy to fund political parties.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting points there. And the sort of reflecting on, as I'm sure you've noticed with a lot of the media over here, there's been this slightly absurd navel gazing of who did Biden speak to first, and having knowledge of both countries as you do. I mean, is this kind of doom mongering perception of, oh well, Joe Biden is got Irish heritage, so therefore the special relationship will be down the tube. Do you think these are slightly overblown, or is it kind of back to normal, or some creative tension between the UK and the US in the coming years, or it's really just very hard to gauge at this stage?
Well, I'm afraid I think the special relationship is a myth. All right. Even the expression, if you ask the average American, what is the special relationship, they'd have no idea what you were talking about. It's a term you only hear over here. And a relationship that is special in only one direction isn't very special. So I do think there is reason to be concerned about Biden's approach to the UK in relation to trade talks, because I do not trust his administration and his advisors to have anything but a completely simplistic and superficial understanding of the process by which the withdrawal agreement came about and what role the border in Ireland played in those negotiations. I think that he's going to accept at face value that that any violation of the withdrawal agreement is also a violation of the Good Friday Agreement, and that's regarded as, if this is more simplistic thinking, as sacrosanct. And so you mustn't, endanger peace in Ireland. And Nancy Pelosi has the same line. It's all incredibly ignorant. Okay, it's not alert to the fact, first of all, that a de facto border down the Irish Sea, where within the United Kingdom there is a customs checks and tariffs, that's wildly in violation of the Good Friday Agreement. But nobody really cares if it's violating unionists' rights under the Good Friday Agreement. They only care about nationalist rights. So that's poorly informed. And there's also no sensitivity in the US to the fact that the EU mercilessly and opportunistically used the Northern Irish border to try to trap the UK permanently within the EU, right? It was all a ploy, and it had nothing to do with peace and justice or the Good Friday Agreement. And I don't trust Biden to be sensitive to any of these nuances. It's just going to say, someone's going to tell him that, like Nancy Pelosi will tell him that the UK is violating the Good Friday Agreement, and then he'll say, then we can't have a trade agreement. After all, a trade agreement with the UK is not that important to the US, is it? So it's all the other direction. And Biden's going to, play to the Irish peanut gallery. There's a huge number of Irish Americans in the US, and it's going to sound good to them. And most, insofar as they have any opinions on the matter, most Irish Americans would support nationalists in Ireland, and again, kind of simplistically be supportive of a united Ireland, and so he's going to play to that audience.
Yeah.
So I don't think the UK is in a great position in terms of a trade agreement.
Yeah. In terms of those, I suppose, theatrics which were pushed and played by the EU. I mean, as a part of you, sort of slightly forlorn in terms of the eccentricities, the bombast of Trump. For example, going to the UN and doing pretty wild speeches, or indeed most speeches that he does. The kind of news by entertainment that disappearing, or at least dissipating to a certain extent in a couple of months. I mean, do you think we'll, in a curious way, kind of miss it when it's gone, or the return to some degree of normality with that is actually, basically welcome, or should be welcomed by everyone?
Yeah, perversely, I think we are going to miss it. I mean, That said, I didn't find Trump very entertaining. I mean, I found him very painful, and I don't like that experience. I don't find being pained all the time and embarrassed and astonished, and not in a good way. I didn't enjoy that experience, and I think I can let it go. What I most want to see the back of is democratic indignation and self-righteousness. All this posturing horror and threats regarding Trump as a threat to the very existence of the republic, and all this. You should see that the New York Times for the last few years has just been one big top this with the left competing with each other as to who can be more extreme, more hyperbolic, more hyperventilating, more extravagantly denunciatory. And I found that act at least as tiresome, or if not more so, than Trump himself. And now, sometimes the worst thing you can do to people is give them what they say they want. They've got power, and now they have to shut up. And I can't wait.
Well, yeah, potentially look forward to some slightly more sterile comment pages in the New York Times. I know they've made some slightly weird doommonger articles about London, sort of saying it's some kind of war zone. But we shall see. We shall see. So, Lionel, thank you very much for joining us today for today's TPA Talks.
I enjoyed talking to you.
Well, thank you for joining us on this edition of TPA Talks. If you enjoyed it, do subscribe to our channel on YouTube. You can see more of our work at taxpayersalliance.com. And we look forward to seeing you on the next edition.